Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Lord of the Flies and how this novel can be applied to different released AP Lit Question 3 prompts. So this is the first video that I intend to make in this little mini series that I'm going to be doing, in which I examine books that I think are very easy for students to read and to use for Question 3. So these books have overt symbols and themes, and they're very plain in their language. Lord of the Flies does have really good description, but overall, it's not a very dense text. Now, these books are also not the heavy hitters of Question 3. They're not as frequently used as some of the other major works like The Scarlet Letter or The Invisible Man, Pride and Prejudice, Frankenstein, but they still have literary merit. And so I think Lord of the Flies is a really good one for students because it's easy to understand and remember, but it's also really easy to apply to a variety of prompts. So one of the first things we need to know about this book is its genre. Now, it is a novel. It's short, but it's a novel. It's also a World War II allegory. So an allegory is a book that has multiple symbols that work together to combine to form this sort of like underlying either political or moral message. And so if you think about all the different symbols as puzzle pieces, if the symbols are puzzle pieces, the allegory is the puzzle once it's all put together. So this book is an allegory because the boys are stranded on this island, and the island is a microcosm for what is going on in the outside world. So the novel is set during World War II, and obviously during World War II, major world powers were fighting against each other. There was the good side and the evil side, depending on, which side you were on. That kind of impacted which side you thought was good. But we have these like dual powers fighting over territory and over what they believe is right. And so we see that kind of fighting and ultimately like the barbaric nature of that fighting on the island itself with the boys. And so the island is a microcosm. It's a smaller representation of what is going on in the outside world during the time of the novel. One of the most important things to understand about a novel is its theme. Now, when you read an AP Lit Question 3 prompt, it's going to say something to the effect of, how does this, and then whatever topic you're writing about, contribute to the meaning of the work as a whole? And so this is when you're supposed to talk about theme. You can also talk about things like character development, but theme is a big one. And so for Lord of the Flies, the subject of the book is civilization versus savagery. And so oftentimes when we talk about a book's subject, we talk about like these two opposite concepts. So civilization, that's how they start the book. They have uniforms, they're well-mannered, they're like these little British boys that have landed on this island. And so they're prim and proper amidst this like tropical island. And then as the book continues, all but essentially Piggy, all the boys descend into savagery at various rates. Their hair becomes longer, they paint their faces, they start to hunt, they are not nice to each other, which sounds like really simple, but the idea is that they are starting to become savages, and we can see this in their behavior. And so that helps us understand theme. Now, at least with my own students, I prefer that they think of theme as a message or a moral, and they phrase it in some sort of complete thought that is not a cliche. Now, this can kind of be difficult because oftentimes when we think of themes, the first thing that pops into our mind usually sounds like something that came off of a fortune cookie. So there is more than one theme per book. At least in my opinion, you can phrase theme in multiple ways, and oftentimes there's more than one theme. So if you are reading a book in preparation for the AP Lit exam, I would come up with at least one, if not two, themes for the text. And so for Lord of the Flies, the one that my students commonly analyze is this idea that evil resides in everyone. So we see this because we have this relationship of civilization versus savagery. So oftentimes the subject will lend itself to the theme. And so subjects are just kind of like words or phrases, and the theme is written as a complete sentence. And it has like some kind of like message behind it, some kind of like universal truth that would apply to, honestly, to more than one book. So when we are analyzing a text, it's important to look for character development and its relationship to theme. Now, a lot of the characters in Lord of the Flies are very archetypical, so they're pretty flat and kind of stagnant, but there is a key moment for Jack where we as the reader are sort of clued into his mindset, and it kind of foreshadows exactly how depraved he's going to become. And so this moment is when he fails to kill the pig. So the pig is caught in these creepers, which are basically like vines in the jungle. And Jack has this idea that they need to go hunting and they need to get food, which at first sounds rather reasonable. I mean, they're stranded on an island and they obviously need to eat. However, when he tries to kill the pig, he can't bring himself to do it. So he has his knife in hand, but he can't actually bring himself to kill the pig. And his reaction is this sort of like internalized, intense anger. He is mad at himself and he vows to not let anyone or anything get the better of him like that again, which is kind of an intense reaction for such a simple moment. I mean, I think we can understand perhaps disappointment or even a tiny bit of self-loathing in that moment, but this is the moment where we really start to see that Jack is going to slowly become unglued and he starts to descend into savagery, because after this moment he becomes obsessed with basically like hunting down the pigs. And then, not to spoil the ending of the book, but after he decides that he's done hunting pigs, he decides to hunt humans. And so this moment shows us that Jack is not only the antagonist, but he's also the villain of the novel. A while back on the AP Lit exam, there was actually a question about how setting influenced theme. And for this particular novel, the setting is an uncharted island. And so there are no adults. The plane has crashed. It has left this scar on the island. So we get the sense that it was a very like rough landing. And there's little features of the setting that are meaningful to the book. So one thing that is interesting about the setting is the presence of the Beastie. And we find out very quickly, or at least we assume very quickly, that the Beastie isn't actually real. But one of the characters realizes that the evil on the island is not this outside force, but it is the force within, like the evil comes from inside them. So a very explicit reference to theme there. And so this character is Simon, and unfortunately he goes to try to tell all the boys his realization, and we get the sense from the description of the event that he's had this sort of like either like epileptic fit or seizure or something, like some kind of hallucination. And so he's kind of crawling on all fours to get back to them, and they mistake him for the Beastie. And spoiler alert, he is killed. And they don't realize they've killed him until after his body gets washed away and all the sort of like jungle gunk and leaves and dirt gets washed off of him. And then they realize it was actually Simon. So the setting contributes to the theme of the novel because we have geographical features that are important. We have the lagoon where the boys start to meet for the first time. And then we have this area called Castle Rock, which is where Jack takes his faction to. So there's lots of geographical markers because of the island setting. And those individual markers have a specific importance to the book as a whole. And so we can analyze the relationship between setting and theme, but also because of how the fact that they're on an island and how that impacts their behavior. They start to do things and behave in ways that they wouldn't if they were back in England. And so a lot of this can all be tied back to the setting as well. It's no secret that Jack is the antagonist in the novel, but the question becomes, is he a villain? What is the difference? And if he is a villain, what is the nature or the root of his villainy? So when we think of a villain, we think of somebody who has no conscience really, and somebody who is rather impulsive and has zero regard for others, and that's Jack to a T. So we know that his pivotal moment, his turning point, was when he failed to kill the pig. And so as the book progresses, as I previously said, he turns from hunting pigs to hunting humans. And for a 12-year-old boy, like, that's psychotic. I mean, for anybody, that's psychotic. But for a 12-year-old to go from, oh, I want to kill this pig for food, to, oh, I want to kill this person who has supposedly wronged me in some way just for fun and sport, like, that's a pretty big jump. And so I would say that there's enough to warrant Jack being called a villain, because he has no, like, remorse. I mean, even when Simon has died and it was an accident, they act like nothing happened. And when Piggy is killed, even though Jack is not the one who kills Piggy, it's actually Roger who launches the boulder over the cliff's edge that kills Piggy. I think we could argue that Roger would not have acted that way if it was not for Jack's influence. And so we see this sort of like, if we're talking about World War II allegories here, we see this like captivating power that such people in charge have. Like, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, like Hitler was a captivating person. He obviously did terrible things, but people liked him, and Jack is able to get this crowd of followers as well. And so even though he is evil and he's the villain, there are traits of his that are sort of maybe not likable, but compelling for others to sort of follow. And so I think in that regard, we could definitely say that Jack is a villain. Lord of the Flies was also used on a recent AP Lit exam that had to do with something called a Bildungsroman, which basically means a coming-of-age novel. Now, because the protagonists in this book are, basically like 12 years old, there's some of the little ones that are about 6, but because they're all roughly like preteen age, it's definitely a coming-of-age novel in that regard. And so we've been talking a lot about Jack, but for this prompt, the person to focus on is arguably Ralph. And the reason why is because Ralph has this moment at the end of the novel where he cries for the first time. And so if you haven't read the ending, I'm about to tell you some about it, so you might want to skip ahead to the next section if that's the case. But a naval officer finally finds the boys. And so he sort of like makes this joke about how like, oh, you've done quite well for yourselves because you're British or something like that. And what he doesn't know is like they've actually been hunting each other, and Jack like pretty much lit the entire island on fire. So yeah, that's doing pretty well for yourselves. And so anyway, Ralph has this moment where he starts crying, and it says like he's crying because of like essentially like 3 things, but one of those things is the loss of his dear friend Piggy. And so we see this as a very important moment because initially Ralph really didn't like Piggy. And even though we as readers know that Piggy is right about a lot of things, he's kind of an annoying character. So we don't really blame Ralph for not liking him, but the two do become friends. And so he mourns Piggy's loss for the first time, but also it's this realization of like exactly how much things have changed, and exactly like his eyes are sort of like suddenly opened to the horrors of the island and what he's been through. And so we see this loss of innocence moment because he's acknowledging his own loss of innocence. There was also a prompt rather recently about symbols and how a symbol contributed to the meaning of the work as a whole. And so if I were writing that prompt, I would write about the Conch-Shell specifically and how it led to this idea that evil resides in all of us. But there are other major symbols as well. So let's talk about the conch first. The conch shell is a shell that sort of like acts like a trumpet initially, and it calls all the boys together. So it represents civilization because they use it almost like a talking stick. And so if you have the conch, you're able to speak. However, rather quickly, the boys sort of violate their own rules because when Piggy has the conch, then other people talk over him, or they just basically disregard the rule of the conch anyway. And so then at one point, the conch basically like they change the rules about like where you can use it and where it does and doesn't have power. So we see this manipulation of the civilization system in place. Now, a key moment if we're going to analyze the conch is actually when the conch breaks. So around the same time in the novel, we have the conch shatter and Piggy dies. And Piggy is the representation of like all things good on the island. And so when he is killed in cold blood, we have the total loss of innocence. We have like zero civilization left. Like it's a literal shattering of civilization, and a metaphorical one too, because this device that they've been using to like basically enact democracy is totally gone. And so in that moment, we see how the symbol shows us what was once like this tool for civilization. It shows us that when it's broken, they've descended into complete savagery. And then we get this connection to evil resides in all of us because, they're committing murder now. So that's the conch. Really briefly, Piggy's glasses are a symbol of knowledge. And they use the glasses to make fire. So it's this like symbol of civilization in some sense as well, but like basically knowledge and fire represents this source of life and rescue. And so when the fire goes out, their chances of being rescued, ultimately diminish. And then we've got the Beastie. So the Beastie, it's this like figure of their imagination, this figment of their imagination, where one of the little ones kind of like concocts this story about how he saw it. And what we find out is that it's actually this, there's this body kind of like in a tree, and it was a parachutist. And so like the different strings are kind of keeping him up in the tree, and he kind of like bobs in the wind. And so admittedly, it probably did look very frightening, but there's not this Beastie on the island. Like there's no giant snake or something that's going to come eat them in the night. But we see this idea that there's a darkness lurking on the island. And then ultimately, when we realize that there is no Beastie, the Beastie becomes symbolic of the evil that resides in us as humans. Again, this theme, because there is no outside threat. Like the Beastie is this like supposed outside threat, but the Beastie doesn't exist. So then we realize that the threat is within, and that these boys are going to tear themselves apart. Like they are going to be the reason for their own destruction. So one really quick thing to add about Piggy's glasses is that, like the Conch-Shell, Piggy's glasses do break. And so the glasses also symbolize logic and reason, because Piggy seems to be the voice of reason for the boys. He has good ideas, but they don't listen to him. Instead, they basically like disregard everything he says. They bully him. They don't view his ideas as having any kind of merit, because he's not Ralph and he's not Jack. He's not the leader that they expect. And so he tries to lead from behind the scenes, but it doesn't really work in his favor. And so when his glasses break, we see this blatant disregard for logic and reason. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. This concludes our analysis of Lord of the Flies. So just to recap, Lord of the Flies is a rather easy book. It's short, it has very obvious symbols and themes, and the book itself is quite easy to read because the language is rather simple. There is good description in the book, but it's not a very dense novel. It is also not one of the heavy hitters of AP Lit. It's not Frankenstein or The Invisible Man, Pride and Prejudice, or The Scarlet Letter, so it has not appeared as frequently as those novels have in terms of which ones have been listed for question 3, but please remember that just because it hasn't been listed on a particular prompt doesn't mean that you can't write about it. The book does have merit. It has been used in the past, so it is fair game if it applies. And so we talked about different prompts today that this relates to. I think there's been other prompts about like cruelty and injustice that this novel would apply to as well. So it's a really good one to have in your arsenal. So if you're trying to prepare for the AP Lit exam and you're trying to cram, this is one that I think you could read very quickly. And there's lots of stuff online if you're looking for like additional resources to, just supplement your understanding. But also I think this is a book that if you're maybe like a sophomore or even a junior and you're just trying to like prepare for AP Lit in some way, this is a good book to read on your own time because it's not very dense, and I think, like I said, it's very easy to understand. So it's a good one to just have knowledge of as you embark on the endeavor that is AP Lit. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. We have some videos coming up in the future. More in this series. We're going to talk about Animal Farm, To Kill a Mockingbird, The House on Mango Street, The Things They Carried, and The Tragedy of Julius Caesar. I think those are going to round out sort of like my list of easy AP Lit books or plays. Possibly Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, just because I remember loving that one when I was a senior in high school, so I might add that one to the list. So if you're curious about those and how to analyze them, which prompts they apply to, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. Make sure that your notifications are turned on. Right now we're looking at videos about every Sunday, and so I'm going to kind of alternate between AP Lit, AP Lang, and Standardized Test Prep. So if you guys have any requests, please leave that in the comments below. So until next time, guys, I'm Coach Hall. Happy writing.